here, so we can easily use it. Do you all turn? You all turners?
No,
Yep. No, some of you are not.
Some people are friends of turners.
Some people are...
Friends of
Oh, friends of turners. Oh, great. Turners have friends, do they?
They do.
That's really nice.
They have a few anyway.
Yes. Also, do you have the books and do you have books and pamphlets? And pamphlets? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What time do you guys want to stop?
When you see them all nodding off.
Sorry?
When they all start nodding off, we'll know it's time to stop.
Oh, really? I've got all night.
It's easy.
Wow.
I have very subtle ways of picturing here, you know.
Oh, well, that's perfect. I brought some books along in case you wanted them. Books you have to pay for. And I brought some pamphlets along, and they're free. Philip, is everybody here?
If I'm here, are you all here?
If you're not here, raise your hand.
There may be one or two, but they'll just wander in later.
Okay. What time do we start, Philip?
What time
Do we start?
start? You can start any minute. Round about now if you want to.
Okay. I was wondering if we waited till past. Okay.
It's about start.
All right. Do you mind me drinking my tea? That's okay. Great. Okay. Well, let's start. And first of all, let me thank Philip very much indeed for inviting me here. And then let me thank you all for coming. Really nice. And I'm going to do something which I don't normally do in college, which is to talk about death and dying. And why do I talk about death and dying? Because I've done some research work on it, and what was quite clear to me is that it's not as we think it is. It's actually something quite different. So that's what I want to talk about. Now, can you hear this okay? Is it clear? Yes? Yes? Okay. So, these are called end-of-life experiences, or ELLIes. So if I refer to an ELLIE, you'll know it's an end-of-life experience. And what I thought I'd talk about is a little bit more about the spiritual perspective of dying. In fact, the more you look into it, the more we find that we don't actually know yet, or even about the physical aspects. There's a lot more to be learned, particularly about the way that the energetic body within us disintegrates and what that means. But that's not for this evening. So, why have we not studied dying in depth? Well, you're all scared, aren't you? have you ever gone to a party and said, okay, let's talk about death and dying? It sort of creates a big circle. Nobody wants to do it. Do we accept that we will die? No, we don't. You all said yes to that, didn't you? You're wrong. And when we discuss death, we talk about other people's deaths. You know, have you heard so-and-so's died? But you never say, when I die, I will, I won't, I think. You never do that. You always talk about other people. And that's called Freud's paradox. So we refuse to accept the fact that we're going to die. But in fact, as you know, the enlightenment process is in fact the death of the self, small self, death of the ego is what it's about. So that's in fact when you do die. And I suspect, Philip will correct me here, that there's some points in the turning when you get close to experiencing that. Is that correct? So there you go, guys. All right, so a few of us are prepared to look closely at death. I wrote an article for a famous London newspaper and sent it to them. I didn't hear much back, so I finally rang up the editor and said, did he like my article? And he said, yes, he did, very much. But you see, we do die. It's so depressing. Oh yes, they all will do die, believe you me. And it needn't be depressing. But that's the sort of feeling about it. And so we tend in our culture, not in every culture, but in our culture, to sweep death under the carpet. We don't really like looking at it too much. So let's just have a look at deathbed rituals in our culture and what has happened to how you die. Here's Napoleon, 1821. Do you like that? There's Napoleon, you can see him. Look who's around him. This is what I want you to see. There are his generals. That was nice of them to come to Elba. And there's his wife. And do you see the children? They're all part of it, aren't they? And so in those days, death in fact was a family and also a professional affair. It was quite interesting. Here's a Victorian scene, which I also like. I remember in Victorian times, death was very common. Probably most of you would have had 4 or 5 brothers or sisters who will have died when you were young. Everybody lived with it. They all knew what it was. This is a nice family deathbed, about 1860. You can see the mothers dying, fathers there, and all the kids are there. It's very much a family affair. But then it was an everyday thing. So people were used to it. 21st century. Do you really want that? Because that's where you're heading for, unless you make special arrangements to stop it. Because we, in the medical profession, can't let people die, or not easily. We try to keep them alive as long as we can. And so that's how you'll end up. Pipes, ventilators, cardiac monitors, everything. And they won't let you die. Or not easily. There comes a time when they sometimes say, okay, well look, we better switch some of the machinery off. But by then, all the phenomena of dying and the process of dying will have passed. And so you've missed out on what dying actually is. But it's not that. So let's look at contemporary Western attitudes to death. And they're really quite interesting. Death is medicalized and banished from the home. What happens if you get seriously ill? Do people say, oh, we'll leave them at home? No, you don't. You go to hospital. So you don't have death in the home. It's not natural. It said it's medical failure. Do you see what we've done? We've taken it all out of the natural process of life. Life isn't natural anymore. It's offensive and should not occur in private. And daily life is unmarked by death. Death is an embarrassment. Often the dying and bereaved are isolated. I don't know if any of you have been aware of a friend of yours or an acquaintance of yours, in particular an acquaintance who's had a child die, meeting them in the street and then feeling embarrassed in yourself, not sure what to say. So you tend to make the contact with them quite quick, rather than maybe saying nothing, just holding them. So we've lost how to behave to people who are in fact bereaved or dying. And one of my co-workers, Sue Brain, has written a book called The D Word. D stands for death or dying. And it's all about interviews with people as to what our current view is about death and dying. The other thing is, Wooden Basset do it. Do you remember Wooden Basset, where people come back from Afghanistan having been killed? You see the coffins going through the streets. Well, people line up and they tend to cross their hands in front of them. They tend to bow their heads as the coffin goes by. And that's what we used to do everywhere. And so a funeral cortege was something which was respected in our society, but it isn't now. When you get a funeral cortege going along the road, what do the people behind do? They blow their horns, overtake, do everything. The reverence of dying is not valued in any sense. We just die. But it's not recognised. And morticians then create the illusion of life, and when you go, they really make you look very beautiful in your coffin. So the current situation is 32% of Britons fear dying alone. How many of you are frightened of dying alone? You're not going to get quite up to 32%, are you? Maybe you don't want to say. But it's a very common fear. I don't want to die alone. 56% of us, in fact over half, will die in NHS hospitals. Do you see that picture I showed you? It's going to happen to half of you, unless you stop it in some way. NHS spending on dying is minimal. It's been a bit more recently. And in NHS hospitals, and listen to this, NHS trust hospitals, the major hospitals where most people die, in NHS hospitals more than 50% of the complaints refer to care of the dying. So of all the complaints in a trust hospital, 50% of them relate to how the dying people haven't been cared for properly. It's a really nasty statistic, that. It shows us that there's something very wrong with how we understand dying in our culture. F5, is it? Okay, not even the computer wants to think about time. How do I get it back, Reggie? Thank you. So let's move on. Okay, why have we not studied dying? Studied the experience of dying? Because dying is a dissolution of consciousness and should help us to its nature and to the spirituality of dying. So that's why we need to look at it and think about it and what it does. So is death the end of everything, or the start of a journey? What is the evidence? So what I'm going to do is now do an evidence-based talk. So let's discuss the phenomena surrounding death. These are end-of-life experiences, as I've said, they're ELLIs. And this is the way that we collected the data for our studies. It's a questionnaire which was given to hospices in the south of England, in Holland, and Una McColville, who's a doctor, gave it to hospices in Ireland. So those are three data sources: UK, Holland, and Ireland. And we did a 5-year retrospective. So we went into we first of all actually went to a palliative care team, designed a questionnaire. Then we went into a hospice and said to the carers of the dying, tell me, what did you experience in the last 5 years? It's retrospective. Now what we found is that we changed the culture in hospices, because these things aren't usually talked about. So we then went back a year later and did a prospective study, and so everybody in fact kept diaries and so on. So that is the database. Carers filled out a questionnaire and had a 1-hour interview, so that they were questionnaire studies, 5-year retrospective and 1-year prospective. And those are the lovely people who did it. Sue Brain, a psychotherapist; Hilary Lovelace, an experienced hospice nurse. She's now gone to New Zealand, and we hope she'll be doing some studies on Maori people. And Inika Kodam, who's an experienced hospice worker from Holland, and then Una McColville. So those are the people who did the studies. I'm sorry, I'm pressing the wrong way. So the data sets, in fact, were one palliative care team where we did our studies, then 2 English hospices and 3 Dutch hospices, 1 UK nursing home, and then 1 in Ireland. But because I actually quite like talking on TV chat shows, Richard and Judy, do you all know Richard and Judy? Wonderful chat show for data. So you go on Richard and Judy and you ask people for their experiences. We got over 500 emails, newspaper articles brought in 400, and then radio, particularly in the USA. Any of you spoken on USA radio? Hey, well done. The one I spoke on was Coast to Coast. Was that yours? Was yours or not? Okay. Well, Coast to Coast is an amazing radio show. So if you get the opportunity to go on and do, because you get a microphone and a population of 10 million for 3 hours. I mean, you know, who could want more than speaking to 10 million people for 3 hours? But what's really nice is they come with their experiences and so on, can discuss them. There's loads of time. It's great fun. So we got a lot of emails from that. So 160 carers questioned, doctors, nurses, auxiliary staff, chaplains, volunteers, and then there's this huge database of ordinary people and ordinary experiences. The questionnaire looked at deathbed visions, deathbed coincidences, light surrounding the body at death, shapes seen leaving the body at death, transiting to a new reality before death, seeing from the corner of the eye, humming and singing just before death, and carers' view of this phenomenon, and carers' training. It was actually, there were 46 questions in all. There is obviously some wrong, but you can see the range of things we did. And surely most of them, the answer must be no. It would be quite wrong. So here are the results. First of all, do they occur? That's our first question, because when we did this study, remember we're one of the first people in the field, and so we weren't sure that they really occurred. And the answer is, yes, they do. Do you see the blue one? That is in fact the 5-year retrospective study. And so if we ask the carers in the last 5 years, 90% of the carers had experienced some end-of-life experiences. So that means they're not uncommon. But the really good data is the green ones, which is the 1-year prospective study. So they were looking out, and you can see that about 45% had 1 to 5 experiences, Then there's another group, which is a much smaller group, about 5%, that had 5 to 10 experiences in the year. But look at the other group, which is 10% of the sample. They had 10 to 20. Now remember that not everybody spent as much time with the dying. So if you spent a lot of time with the dying, you saw a lot of end-of-life experiences. So they're there, and they're not uncommon. In fact, some of the figures given are about 50%. That's in 2 recent papers, because fortunately other people are now taking them up. Here's one. This is 2003. Approximately 10% of all dying people are conscious, so you have to be conscious to report these, shortly before their deaths, and of these people it's estimated that 50 to 60% experience deathbed phenomena. So do you get it? If you're conscious, there's well over a 50% chance that you'll have an end-of-life experience. Does that matter? Yes, I think it does. I think it matters a lot. Do we set out to keep people conscious while they're dying? No, we don't. Why not? Because we send them to hospital. What happens? They go into intensive care. What happens in intensive care? They're put on respirators, heart monitors, and they're given drugs to make them unconscious. So we miss this whole thing by sending them to hospital. So training and care of the carers could bias the results between the studies. In fact, if one group of carers really knew about these see more than others who didn't know about them. So he asked them about their training, and this is fascinating. The first light blue column is the English retrospective studies. How many people had been trained in end-of-life experiences? Or it's not even 10%, it's appalling, isn't it? This is one of the main things about dying. We don't even train our carers. But look at the Dutch, they're the red ones. Nearly 70% of carers in Holland, in fact, are trained in this. The Irish are even worse than the English. And the people who got training during that year, it's gone up to just over 10%. So we still don't do it properly. So yes, there is going to be a bias, so you'd expect probably the Dutch people to see more things because their carers are trained. So what is the death process? And this is a cartoon that I made. Is there a mouse? Yes, there is, if I can find it there. It starts with premonitions. Some people know when they're going to die. And this, of course, is not gone into very much. Then the next stage are deathbed visions, and you need to know this because you can negotiate with your deathbed vision and ask them if when they come back to collect you, they'd wait a bit. There are certain things that they will wait for and certain things they won't. And parties are not things that they'll wait for. But some of your relatives, like your son or daughter coming from a different country, they'll say, yeah, sure, we'll wait for that. Then you go on a journey, you go into a new reality, and then this was one of the reasons why I got interested in this, because I dealt with people who had near-death experiences, and we'd looked at the population of people with near-death experiences during cardiac arrest. So these people were clinically dead when they had their near-death experiences, as far as we could tell. And they suggested that the reality they went into when they had their cardiac arrest was very similar to that of the ordinary near-death experience. We published 1 or 2 papers on that study. So this shows us that if you're unconscious, you can have a near-death experience. And so the question that I asked was, surely this period here, this in fact is a good model for what the dying process is. So do dying people have the same thing? And the answer is yes, they do. And this transiting from here in the hospice to this other reality is what happens. Then just before you die, there's terminal lucidity, which I'll talk more about. And then there's the time of death. And then there is this very loving connection that the dying person makes at the moment of death with people to whom they're very closely emotionally attached. And they're called deathbed coincidences. There's the cardiac arrest data. But also at the time there are a whole lot of other phenomena like clock stopping, etc., which I'll talk about at the moment of death. So the moment of death is very special. And I think that what we're looking at is in fact the loosening of consciousness as we go through the death process. So let's start then at the beginning of the series, and this is premonitions, and the Dalai Lama says 1 to 2 years before death you know when you're going to die. And so the question is, how do you know? He says, because if you listen acutely you can tell. We don't know what this means because we can't listen acutely, but it means really becoming tuned to what's going on within you and without you and around you. That gives you the information. Or you can in a dream. So I chose you Lincoln's dream. How many of you know Lincoln's dream? One or two, but not many. Okay, this is Lincoln's dream. Do you remember Lincoln was shot by an assassin? About 10 days ago, this is Lincoln, this is his account of the dream. When I fell into a slumber, for I was weary, I soon began to dream. There seemed to be a death-like stillness about me. Then I heard subdued sobs as if a number of people were weeping. I wandered downstairs, so he's in the White House. I wandered downstairs. There the silence was broken by the same pitiful sobbing. What could be the meaning of all this? I kept on until I arrived at the east room, which I entered. Before me was a catafalque on which rested a corpse wrapped in funeral vestments, whose face was covered, others weeping pitifully. "Who is dead in the White House?" I demanded of one of the soldiers. "The President," was his answer. "He was killed by an assassin." So the dream absolutely foretells what was going to happen. Then came a loud burst of grief from the crowd, which woke me from my dream. It was only a dream. I've been strangely annoyed by it ever since. Well, he didn't take it as a precedent, did he? Not of value apart from being annoying. Now, a lot of people, I don't know how many, but we got a number of accounts of premonitions of dying when we were doing our dream book. And of course you remember the Aberfan disaster, and there were quite a lot of accounts of that and so on. But in fact, we got a lot of stories about premonitions too. My third daughter, Roberta, this is an interesting one, particularly if you listen to it in detail. My third daughter, Roberta, was just 7 years old on May the 7th in 1989. I think this is one of the American stories, in fact, from coast to coast. When I woke up in the morning, totally upset and in mourning over her death, so she wakes up feeling that her daughter's died, I was so surprised and confused to see her lying next to me that I actually gently nudged her to see if she was alive. She'd apparently gotten up during the night and climbed in next to me. When she moved, I cried uncontrollably with relief that she was not dead and hugged her. She did not seem to mind or make any fuss. Perhaps she knew why I felt relief. I did not tell her. I thought that she was dead. I could not remember any dream. Remember, this are all very strong feelings, no actual dream imagery. But the feelings were so strong and real, exactly as they were 2 days later, when she was the victim of a hit-and-run accident. It was a very good premonition that the person was going to die. Now, in fact, we miss these because we don't look for them and discount them like Lincoln did when they occur. And so there's the whole premonition thing. I got a lovely one from the University of the Third Age when I was talking about this. It was the mother who was talking about her daughter. And her daughter was married to a man who, he's about 25, and they had 2 young children. And he said, he had finished doing everything he came into the world for, whatever that meant. And it was time for him to die, and he would be dying soon, so he put all his affairs in order. And of course the wife was really unhappy about this. And being a psychiatrist, I knew exactly what was going to happen. He's going to commit suicide, wasn't he? He was really depressed. Not a bit of it. He was fine. He was okay at work. And then his business sent him on an overseas assignment, and they had a small aircraft taking their people to the country, and it crashed and he was killed. So again, he had a premonition of what was going to happen. Now we come on to the next stage, which is deathbed visions. They can give you premonitions, but they don't have to. They may start 3 to 4 weeks before death. This is the one I really love. Don't you love that? How many of you have been to Assisi? There is St. Francis. Yeah. Have you seen it on the tour? I mean, they're really lovely. And you can see St. Francis there. He's having great fun, isn't he? Look at all those angels. There's St. Francis. Those angels that have come to collect him. That's what I want. But I don't think I get that. Probably be my mother. Okay, so the next question is, if we have it in our culture, do they occur now? Well, you can see 60% of the carers in the English retrospective study, the accounts of them. In the Dutch, 70% did. In the Irish retrospective, nearly 55% did. And in the English prospective, which is the most solid data, over 45% did. So they're common and they occur and they're significant in my view. So you can't say any longer that they don't exist, because they clearly do. And here's one which is a deathbed visitor, and at the same time it's a premonition. It's a rather nice one, because it crosses the boundaries. My mother was in hospital after a fall and had fractured her ribs. One day she saw my dead brother at the door of her room. Now the interesting thing here is, if you go into hospital with fractured ribs, you're not going to die, are you? Just get antibiotics, and if it's punctured or like, they reseal it and you come out. But at any rate, she said it had made her very happy to see him. Now what would you all think if you were in hospital and you saw your dead body, your dead brother? Would you all be happy to see him? I want you to just note the disjunction between how she felt about seeing her brother, dead brother, and how we would feel. You see, there's already a process going on. I joked that he had come to take her on to the next world, and we laughed about it. 2 weeks later, she died unexpectedly. So that was a premonition and a deathbed vision, the two of them occurring together at about the same time. So that's really interesting. And why is it that she accepted the appearance of her dead brother so easily? I think because she knew at some level it was a premonition. Now the next thing that happens to the dying is that their language changes, becomes journeying language. I joined my daughter after an hour at the hospital, and we both sat chatting to my mother. She spoke to me about my life and my future, all interspersed with references to these people who are now at the end of her bed. Note where the deathbed visions stand. She told us that she wouldn't be there the next day, as these people would pick her up when she fell and take her on a journey. We were slightly spooked at her comments, but she was totally at ease. She insisted that we shouldn't cry when she died. We then left her and said that we would return later on Christmas Eve, by which time, in fact, she was dead. So, do you see how her language changes? She's going on a journey, they're going home, they'll be picked up, their relatives will call for them. So that dying, if they have a deathbed visitor, no longer think that that's the end, because they behave as if it's going to continue. So you get journeying language. The other thing is that this is the most interesting story because it's one like Sir William Barrett in 1890 who became interested in this. And what it is a deathbed visitor that the person who was dying could not have known was dead. My father was terminally ill with cancer. Just a couple of days before his death, my grandmother died suddenly, but we did not tell my father, as he'd been very close to his mother-in-law. We did not want to upset him, so we didn't tell him. As he was passing away, he turned to my mother and said, "Your mum is here. What on earth is she doing here?" He then smiled and died. I think the fact that my father could not possibly have known that his mother-in-law was dead makes this experience all the more interesting and, to my mind, convincing of an afterlife. So what he's arguing is the fact that somebody had died, the person who was dying didn't know this, but yet this person appeared to them, suggests that there's a continuation of consciousness. Now you can turn it around in many different ways, but that's the data, so you need to explain it in some sort of way. The next thing is, do you remember we were talking about deathbed visitors coming into the room? Quite often they start outside the hospice, they come into the corridor, come into the room, stand at the end of the bed, and then they come and sit on the bed. Why do they sit on the bed? Well, those of you who've had children who've been ill, what do? You come and sit on the bed, don't you? Hold their hands, mop their brows, because it's a very comforting thing to do. And this is why the deathbed visitors do it, because it's very comforting for the people who are dying. Do they sit on the bed, or is it just imagination? No, they do sit on the bed. In all the different studies, it's over 60% of deathbed visitors sit on the bed. And it is, I think, because it's a very comforting thing for a visitor to do, particularly if they held your hands, which they sometimes do. So, who are the visitors? Really interesting. And this is why I know it's going to be my mum. Because a quarter of parents, then persons unknown, 17%, they're usually in fact spiritual. Greeting the person who's dying sometimes doesn't have speech, but they greet their deathbed relatives very enthusiastically. Other relatives 14%, spouses 14%, siblings, probably because not so many siblings have died, 9%, and then grandparents 3%. In our culture, we have very few angels. Sorry about that, guys. But I think actually now you know this, you can probably order who you want. If you want an angel, make certain that you order an angel. I'd like an angel. And friends, 3%. Now, in fact, when I made this slide up, or this was, do you see, this is 102 people, so it's 118 visions, because some people have 2 visions. So it's 102 people, it's quite a large sample. And we haven't got as many animal ones as we have now. And animals, in fact, do occur, so you may be visited if you had a pet cat who you really love, it might come to pick you up with your mum. Do you like this? Yeah, I thought it was going to be my mum. So who sees them? So who sees the deathbed visitors? Well, the dying, obviously, because they come from them. Very rarely others in the room, especially children, and it depends where you go. If you have carers who are psychically sensitive, they quite often see them. And very, very rarely hospice or hospital staff. Now, as soon as other people see them, they're no longer hallucinations, they're veridical perceptions. Do you understand? It puts them into a different sort of category. So you have to bear that in mind when you think about them. So you can't say they're just hallucinations, because they're not for some people. And so how do they come? Well, just as I've told you, often come into the room shortly before death, will stand around or sit on the deathbed in the room. They appear to be in real space, as the dying direct their gaze and comments to a particular place. In other words, they seem to be fully formed to the person who's dying. There may be more than one person. And occasionally unknown people wait at a distance and come closer as death approaches. As I say, they're usually spiritual. So we have lovely stories about a man who was welcoming some of his friends who had died in the war. He was shaking their hand like this and greeting them by name. And the son was sitting there, and just to be irritating, I suppose, he held his hand out so that his father, who was dying, could get it and shake it. So his father shook it and then pushed it away and went on shaking. So they could tell the difference between a deathbed visitor and somebody who is in fact in real space and time. Why do they come? Well, that's clear. This is all from these 110 visions. This is what the people said. They come to greet them, to reassure them that they will be with them, to tell them when it's time to go, to take them on a journey. Then remember this one, they can be negotiated with and the time of death delayed for a short time. They actually will probably let you go home. If you're in hospital and you want to see your garden once more before you die, they'll probably let you do that, but they won't do much more than that. So if you want to go to the races, I don't think so somehow. Here's a delaying tactic from one of our stories. My sister heard Dad talking very crossly to someone in his room. Fearing that one of the children had gone in and upset him, she went in to see what was going on. Only Dad was there, in his bed. My sister asked him who he was talking to, and he replied, "I was telling the angels that I was not ready to go yet." He knew I was coming, was determined to stay alive until I had seen him. The angels obviously let him. So remember that, you can negotiate a bit. He's refusing to die. His horse races are on Saturday. Is there a cultural bias? Yes, there is. There's one study which talks about India and the US, and it's by Osis and Haraldson, mainly Haraldson. And if you look at those pie-shaped graphs, the top one is in fact the US study, so that culture is similar to ours. And the takeaway visions, or the deathbed visions, are about 70%. 15% are religious figures, and the others are nothing to do with the dying process. So you can see 70 is against 15, but look how it changes when you go to India, and they expect more religious figures, so they get more religious figures. In fact, it's 50% instead of 13 with us, and it's 29% instead of 70 for the family figures. So there's a large cultural influence there. Now there's a lady called Katia, and she's been doing a prospective study in Brazil, and she says that on the whole, in her small survey, which was a PhD thesis, people could have some control of the people who came to pick them up. So remember that, and that's why you must know it. What are the explanations? That the people are confused? No, that's not true, because these all occur in clear consciousness. Intensive care psychosis, no, it's not that, because people there are very paranoid, and these are not paranoid. Sensory deprivation, because remember, some of these people are lying very still in bed. No, because you don't see visitors like this with the emotional context. A sensory deprivation one is lying in bed and seeing tiles extending. This is an actual one, and there were pillars. Behind the pillars were bishops. The bishops would come out and say, "Hello," and go back behind the pillar. "Hello," and go back again. That's very different from a deathbed vision, so it's not that. Organic psychosis, no, because they're not psychosis. Hypnagogic, that means on the borders of sleep, no, because these people are not on the borders of sleep. Drugs, no, they're quite different from drug visions. There you see animals, things on the carpet, wallpaper moving, they're quite different. Temporal lobe epilepsy, absolutely not, because I know a lot about that. It's nothing like a temporal lobe seizure. Dreams, the people say they're not dreams, and they're very much like, as I was saying, the experiences that people get in the near-death experience. So I think they are a new category of phenomena. Now we go on down with the dying process, and we come to this one there, going into a new reality, and it's exactly like the near-death experience. Here, does it occur? Yes, it does. 30% in the English retrospective, but that's the good data at the end there, the light blue. That's almost up to 50%, which is the same as the Dutch. So yes, people do actually do this. And when they go into a new reality, what is it like? The Irishness article that you probably noticed. Here's a 32-year-old woman dying of breast cancer, and this is in the last 2 to 3 days, and this was a story which was given to me by her mother. She was conscious, and a dark roof over her head, so she became aware of a dark roof. Then through this dark roof was a bright light, echoing the near-death experience. And she moved towards the bright light. And she said she moved into a waiting place where beings were talking to her there to help her, very much like the near-death experience. Everything would be okay. And they were loving beings. It wasn't a dream. They could all make the distinction between a dream and these states. Her grandfather was amongst them, and so they were the dead relatives. And she moved in and out of the area, and sometimes people say, oh, I'm back here. And then they go back to the other area again, and they alternate between the two realities. So it's the beginning of a transitional process. My father was at my grandfather's bedside, deeply distressed. But my grandfather quietly said to my father, don't worry, Leslie, I am all right. I can see and hear the most beautiful things, and you must not worry. So he's made this transition, and he quietly died, lucid to the end. So there's a very good account then of part of the process of dying, and in some people the moving onwards into a different sort of reality, and the reality is that the near-death experience, I think, or that's what the data seems to suggest. So then you come to the last thing before death, and this in the last 2 years, part of it I think is since we started writing about it, but there is a guy in Germany who's become very interested, and there's a guy in America who's become very interested in it. And these are events which are quite unusual. An unconscious, weak or paralyzed or demented patient, okay? So they may be unconscious, they may not have sat up for a long while because they're so weak. They may in fact have Alzheimer's disease and not recognize the family. Sit up just before they die to say goodbye to relations and often welcome dead relatives. In our series, they mainly welcome dead relatives. So they sit up, say goodbye to the living who are there, welcome the dead relative, then lie back and die. And so why is that? And how is it that if you've got Alzheimer's disease, you can suddenly sit up and recognize people you haven't recognized for maybe years? Now we've got these stories from people in nursing homes where they deal with chronic patients. So we have a lot of stories like that, and you have to explain this in terms of the neuroscience behind it, and it's actually quite difficult. So that's terminal lucidity. Sir Henry Halford, who, this is 1893, a long-serving president of the Royal College of Physicians, wrote, so they've been around a long time. We've all observed the mind clear in an extraordinary manner in the last hours of life. And this is William Monk in 1887. An experienced Victorian physician referred to this phenomena as lightening up before death. Instances occur, not very rarely, where the delirium ceases and the mind again for a time becomes clear and sensations key, be followed, however, ere long by a return of delirium, or it may be of coma, or a rapid sinking of all the bodily powers and speedily death. So you get the fact that they have been around and they're very similar now to what they were then. And it's Michael Nahm, who's the German researcher, and Bruce Grayson, who's the American researcher. Terminal lucidity in patients with chronic schizophrenia and dementia. So it's coming into the scientific literature. They had 81 cases and 49 case reports. It's a very good article for those of you who are interested. And this is one from New Zealand in 2009. Many who work in modern hospices recognize the clinical occurrence, though they suggest that its frequency is rare. And he looked at 100 consecutive hospice deaths attended by him, and there were 6 definite cases of brief periods of lightening up in the final 48 hours of life that he recognized. So that gives an overall frequency of 6%. Do our carers see it? Yes, they do, but note, again, it's only just over 30%. Now, what's got into the Irish? Why do they see so much of this compared to the other ones? The Dutch don't see so much, but the Irish certainly do. They're over 50%, so it's obviously something that they recognise in Ireland. Anyway, just a minute or two before my father died, and believe me, he was incredibly weakened by rampant internal cancer, suddenly sat up in bed, out of the coma, and stretched out his free hand in the direction of the empty armchair at that side of the bed, called his sister's name twice, and then he collapsed back into bed and died, still clutching my hand tightly. So it's a wonderful story which illustrates it very well. So it needs scientific examination. How do you awaken from coma? And how do you, in fact, suddenly lose your Alzheimer's disease, and how you're able to move if you're paralyzed? Really interesting. And it's just worth looking at Halford 1883 and McLeod in 2009. In 1883, lightening up can provide an opportunity for the dying to set his house in order after a deathbed speech and bid farewell. Love the idea of a deathbed speech. I'd like to give a deathbed speech. And then McLeod, predicting the occurrence of this phenomenon, possibly withholding sedation and ensuring the presence of relatives when it occurs, would all be clinically desirable. So he's arguing for a really good, useful use for it in the dying process. So in order to do that, you have to recognize it and make sure the relatives are there. Now we come on to death itself. This is when you die. It's all leading up to death. This is actually the moment of death. And this is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. These are called deathbed coincidences. These are a visit initiated by the dying person at the moment of death to someone of great emotional significance to him or her. And distance is no barrier. So if you have somebody in mind who you would like to say goodbye to, you can do it, or so it seems from the data. And going back to the Giotto frescoes again, here is St. Francis dying without the angels this time in one part of Italy. And this guy is also dying in another part of Italy. And he says, wait for me, St. Francis, I'm coming. So he's aware of St. Francis's death at St. Francis's moment of death, and they're both going to journey together. Now, in actual fact, I got those words out of a book of photographs of Assisi, and I couldn't remember the name of the book, so I put into Google, as one does, please give me the quotation for wait for me, St. Francis, I'm coming. And up came the name Peter Fenwick. So now the reference has become circular. And in fact, Google was quoting me as a reference rather than what I was wanting. That was, in fact, the person who actually said it first. At any rate, this is what Google does. So this is a deathbed coincidence. Let's say you're in Florida and dying. Let's say your son is in the UK. And at the moment of death, you get this bridge between the two of you, and information is exchanged. Now it's very clear, and it takes various forms. And it takes different forms if the person who's getting the visit is awake compared to the form it's in when you're asleep. Well, does it occur? Yes. Apart from in Ireland. But it does. About 50% of the carers have heard about it in the various studies. And even in the prospective study in England, it goes way up to nearly 50%. So it's not uncommon. One morning, around 1950, my father and I had to visit a distant relative, Kate, to tell her that her brother had died the previous day. This is a Scottish one. She lived in a remote part of Easter Ross and was not on the telephone, so there's no communication between Kate and her father, who was dying. When Dad and I arrived at the farmhouse, we were met by Kate, who said, "I know why you've come." So she knew about it. I heard him calling me, saying, "Kate, Kate," as he passed over. She was quite matter-of-fact about it and gave us the time of death, which was exactly the same as that recorded by the hospital. I found it an amazing experience and never forgotten it, nor will I ever. And that's the other point I want to make about these experiences. They're very, very comforting to the bereaved. And here's another one. This is, Kate was awake and she actually heard a voice. Here's another person who's awake. On our way home, I felt this blue light come to me as if he was saying goodbye. It was a jolt, a feeling. I cannot describe it. I did not understand it at the time, but when we got home, I was told that he had died at that moment, and I'll never forget it. He definitely came to me to wish me well and tell me he was on his way. Mum was with him, but I was not, and that's why he came to me. So you can make this last compassionate call to somebody who's very meaningful to you. Is it always meaningful? Yes, except in special circumstances, which I'll tell you about if we have time. Now, if you're asleep, the visit takes the form of a dream. It then becomes a narrative dream, e.g. it tells a story, and also the message can be much more clear, although the ones I've shown you, it's pretty clear when you're awake. 15 years ago, I was woken at 2 in the morning by a sharp push in the back. It woke me up suddenly, but I was not afraid and just knew that my late mother-in-law was standing beside the bed. I knew exactly who it was, even though I could not see anything at all. You got to be really scared if you woke up and knew your dead mother-in-law was standing beside the bed. She wasn't for some reason. I drifted back to sleep and had the most vivid dream where my 22-year-old son was talking to me. He was telling me that he was dead, but that I was not to worry or be upset because he was all right. You see, she gets a very clear message. I'm okay. When I woke, I was very disturbed and tried to contact my son. Incidentally, she's in Australia and he's in the UK. I found out later that day that he'd been drowned the previous night. I'm convinced that he did contact me, as did his grandmother, who loved him deeply, and I've drawn great comfort from this. Now, the story is slightly different from this. And this is put on the slide, but what she was describing was a tunnel, so neither of us are surprised at that, because it echoes the near-death experience. And as the boy was walking down the tunnel, he was dripping wet, but we know he drowned. As he came closer towards her, he stepped into the light, and the light always has the characteristics of love and compassion. And that's when he gave her the message, I'm okay, don't worry about me. So it's a really complex dream about the actual time of death of her son. These deathbed coincidences are very common. Do you always go to somebody you love? Yes, you do. But Haraldson has just done a total survey of experiences in Iceland. And there's a group of people that say strangers come to them who've just died. And without exception, if you meet a stranger, it's usually somebody who's been killed in an accident or had a violent death. And they obviously are disorientated in some way, and so they go to somebody there to give them comfort. And they are, in fact, people who they don't know, they're strangers. But you don't have to consider that, because that's an exception. Normally, it's a wonderful last chance to go and say goodbye to somebody who we hold very close to us. Do things leave the body? Gail came in to tell us that Nick had died. We sat around the bed quietly. What I saw then was totally unexpected. Above Nick's body, the air was moving, rather like a heat haze you see on the road, but swirling slowly around. Any of you read from the Dalai Lama the account of the processes of dying? Well, if you had, you'd know that the first experience is an experience of smoke, rather like this. It's not smoke, but that's what the experience of the dying has. That's what she said she saw leaving the body. The next stage is, the first one is a mirage like that, and the next stage is smoke. As my father, died, something which is very hard to describe because it was so unexpected and because I'd seen nothing like it, left up through his body and out of his head, so there was an exit portal. It resembled distinct, delicate, wavy lines of smoke. Smoke is not the right word, but I've not got a comparison, and then disappeared. I was the only one to see it. It left me with such a sense of peace and comfort. Okay? So that's the next stage of dying. You go on to sparks. We've got lovely accounts of sparks in the room as people die. And the flickering of a butter lamp, they say. In other words, a flickering flame. I got some lovely ones of flickering flames. So that brings us on to life at death, light at death. And the whole business of light at death is, again, much more complex than we think. And one of the things I'd like to do is to get photometers and see if we can actually measure the energetic process of the dying. But you get radiant light coming from the body. Do many of the carers see it? Yes, nearly half the carers have seen radiant light coming from the body in Holland. And in the prospective study in England, about 35% have. So again, it's not uncommon. So there's the body. The guy's just died, and it's surrounded with radiant light. Interesting? I find it fascinating. What is it? Suddenly I was aware that her dead father was stood at the foot of her bed. So that's a deathbed vision. My mother was staring at him too, and her face was lit up with joy. It was then that I saw her face appear to be glowing with a gold light. The light began to lead through the top of her head and go towards the ceiling. Looking back to my mother's face, I saw that she was no longer breathing. Totally fascinating. Now, I haven't got them here, but I spoke to a couple of priests who did a lot of work with the dying, and they said it's not unusual for there to be a flame seen in the room of the dying. Nothing to do with the hospice or a real flame, but it's a flame that comes at the time of death and is seen with the dying. So again, all these phenomena need to be thought about. Now we go on to other things which occur at the time of dying. Clocks stop, animals respond, and machines malfunction. I won't go into this, but do clocks actually stop? Well, yes, that's 45%. In the English and the Dutch studies, and in the retrospective it's 25%. They don't stop so much in Ireland, but they do if you're looking out for it. Clock stories are very, very common. And the question I had, is it only grandfather clocks? You know the song. my grandfather clock stopped dead, never to go again, when the old man died. You know that story, song. Well, there's a whole story related to that, and it comes from Yorkshire song, but I won't go into it. But do they really stop? What about electronic clocks? Do they stop? So I've got a nice story for you. It's called Uncle Archie's Clock. My father died at 3:15 a.m. At about 8:30 a.m. I went to tell my Uncle Archie, who'd been close to Dad, so it's his brother. As Uncle Archie opened the door, it was clear that he was distressed. And as I began to tell him, he interrupted me and said he already knew. He said no one had telephoned him, but told me to look at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was stopped at 3:15. That's the pendulum one. As was indeed his own wristwatch, so wristwatches do it, his bedside clock and all other clocks in the house. There was even an LED display, I think on the radio, flashing 3:15. What do you make of that? I was completely taken aback, but Archie seemed comfortable with the phenomenon and was just concerned at losing someone close. Interesting. All clocks stop, even electronic clocks. What is it? We don't understand it yet. On the morning of my mother's death, I had wound her clock, of which she was very fond, and put it at the right time before going to work. So she knew her mum's ill. While at work, a nurse phoned to tell me that my mother had died at 10 minutes to 11 that morning. She had not been expected to die that day, and I was very upset that I had not been with her. I drove straight home, and the first thing I saw on entering the house was that the clock had stopped at 10 minutes to 11 exactly. So those are the sorts of stories you've got. And 21 years later, it's still going strong on my mantelpiece. Why should it stop only on that occasion, at the time of her mother's death? So think about this linkage. It doesn't only go out to people you know, it goes out to things which are important to you as well. TVs stop quite often in the room of the person, and alarms go off. And animals respond too. Do you all know the story of Oscar the cat? Published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Very high-ranking journal. To get a story in there is amazing. To get a story about a cat in the New England Journal of Medicine is miraculous. And Oscar was a cat in a hospice, and the person who was writing the story, the doctor, noticed that the cat would curl up on the beds of people who were going to die. And so that's the story of Oscar the cat. And I mentioned this on the Richard and Judy's show, and I got three hospices who sent emails to me to say why. Yes, they had a cat exactly like that. So it's obviously quite common, and people in hospices know about it. So the Arthur Rank Hospice in Cambridge, which sits on the bed of dying patients 24 to 48 hours before they die. Somebody on the internet put, "What is the virus that cats carry?" Which I thought was rather nice. When my father was at St. Peter's Hospice in Bristol, we became aware of a cat there named Peter. My dad was never particularly fond of cats, but even he welcomed Peter onto his bed. Should have known better. Mum noticed that the cats paid particular attention to some patients who seemed to them to be the next to die. Mentioning this to a nurse, she was told that he did indeed do this, and that when they had more than one very ill patient, they tended to know who would be the first, as that would be where Peter was spending his time. A couple of the staff denied the link, but most just gave a knowing smile and said simply, "Oh, so you've noticed that." That's quite interesting. Birds, I won't go through all these, but I've just had some lovely stories. This is a jackdaw. There's always a relationship between the person and the bird. This is a jackdaw who came to visit. But the latest ones I've got are from a Zen hospice in the States. And it's in a rural area, which a lot of the stories I have don't come from. And robins will come and wait on the windowsill of the dying, and people have special relationships with a bird, like a robin, and there will be loads of them that come. So this relationship, this emotional relationship you set up, manifests itself in visits from these things at the time that you die. Okay, so what are end-of-life experiences? Well, the carers think that they're transpersonal. 80% of the Dutch and 80% of the prospective English study, the Irish aren't so sure. What's transpersonal? Spiritual. So they're really deep spiritual experiences. That's what the carers say. Are they due to organic factors? This looks very high, but it's only 12%. In fact, it's just the scaling of the way the graphs were done. So most of them don't think they're due to organic factors. So when we became interested in it, we wrote our book, which is a new Ars Moriendi. Ars Moriendi was a book which was published at the time of the Great Death, the Black Death, when there weren't enough priests to go around because most of them have died. And so we called it The Art of Dying, but it should have been The Art of Dying. Well, it isn't. It's called The Art of Dying. It contains lots of stories about all this. And we carried out a brainstorming session with hospice and nursing carers. We said to them, what do you need? They said they wanted an educational booklet. So we're very lucky. And the Kindersleys, some of you will know the Kindersleys. Any of you know the Kindersleys? Peter Kindersley, Julia Kindersley. Yeah, people who are old college people will know them. They very kindly gave us a grant. And so we wrote this book. It's an end-of-life book for carers of the dying. And they're free, and if you want one, do take one, because it's paid for by the Kindersleys. And then, when Sue's father was dying, she wrote this book, which is nearing the end of life, a guide for relatives and friends of the dying. I'm really pleased. I think it's a lovely book, and we got another charity to fund this. And we sent both these books out to every hospice in this country, to a lot of nursing homes. Of course, it's been translated into Dutch and has gone out to the Dutch people. It's been translated into Chinese, and it's all over Hong Kong. It's going into China. So it's really welcomed as a very good addition to the literature on dying. So let's wrap it all up and think about what's a good death. The person has died as he or she wanted, which is very important. So you have to want. So don't let yourself just be pushed into hospital. When you've got terminal cancer, come on, you know you've got terminal cancer. Get your family around you and die at home. In fact, in this country, we're extremely lucky because there's a very good district nursing service which will look after you, and will nurses if you have cancer. The opportunity to talk about fears that they may have about dying, or if they've had end-of-life experiences, to have them validated. There's nothing more depressing for a person who's dying than to have a deathbed vision and the nurse to say, don't worry dear, it's only the drugs. It's not the drugs, there's no evidence that it's the drugs. They are very meaningful. So it's really nice for the carer to say, yes, it's a vision of a dead relative. The chance to settle unfinished business and say farewell, and this is one of the things we've found about the dying process. It allows rifts to be mended. The ability to choose the time today, either alone or with the family present, and that's important because not everybody wants to die with the family around. Here's a final meaning one. It's a reconciliation. It's a lovely story, this. My father and I had never got on, and I'd left home at the age of 16 and never gone back. So he lost his son at the age of 16. One day on my way to work, this is the son speaking, I had a sudden need instead to head north for home. Well, this is getting very close to a deathbed coincidence, isn't it? He's got a compulsion suddenly to go home. When I arrived, Mum came rushing out in tears. My father was dying of cancer. They had not been able to get in touch with me. I made my peace with my dead father, who said that he'd seen me, he was ready to go. He died that night. So the whole thing is looked after with some people in the most extraordinary way. Reconciliation is one of the main things. And these quotes I've taken from somebody called Marie de Hensel, and there's an interesting story about this book. Any of you know the concept of the library angel? No? Do you mean to say you've all lived this long without knowing about the library angel? It is terrible. The library angel is in every library. It's a construct of Jung's. And the library angel will help you find books. And you have to go and ask the library angel's help. Say you want to find a particular book, etc. And I was down in Bath at a meeting, and I went to the station, and I had an hour and a half to kill. And so I walked down towards Bath, and there was a second-hand bookshop there. And I was just becoming interested in this sort of thing. So I went into the shop and said, "Did they have any books on death and dying?" Well, you know the sort of response you get. Said, "No, absolutely not." And I looked around the shelves and I could see that this was not going to be correct. So I said to the library angel, "Will you find me, please, on death and dying?" And then you just wander around. My attention was caught by a book by a Donne on time, which I was interested in. It's one of Donne's books, which I hadn't seen. And so I went to pull it out, and as I pulled it out, the book next to it, which is what always happens, fell onto the floor. And this was Marie de Hensel's Intimate Death. And she is the first psychologist in the first hospice in Paris. And it was full of stories of the dying. It's the most wonderful book. And here's some quotes from it, given to me by the library angel. "You can be clear-headed about the approach of death and yet stay absolutely alive until death comes. And that's very important. So don't die too soon." In other words, think, "Oh God, I got cancer, it's the end." It's not the end, because you've got this process yet. "I'm not a believer, but I'm curious to know what happens next." Patient's quote. I think that's me, really. I want to know what happens next. And then the other thing is, confidence in the unfolding of things is more important than a belief that may not be rooted in a deep inner trust. And so these things unfold naturally and lead you through the process. It's not faith, but the texture of a life lived that allows one to give oneself into the arms of death. This is why reconciliation and love at the time of death is so strong in the room of the dying. So dying is a spiritual process. It's the exit of consciousness. It's poorly understood and neglected. But in my view, from all the accounts I've heard, it's definitely a process of love. And so, with death, you go into the clear light, so they say. Death is a process, it's a shutting down, it's the end of the body, but it may not be the final end. But this is at the start of the journey to elsewhere. And that's the subtitle of our book, because that's what the dying say. So when you die, you start this journey. And then one doesn't know really what happens. Okay? If you have any questions, loads of questions. Any questions from you?
What happened? And you did a study, I think, where you were putting images on top of.
This is the near-death experience study. And again, it's just an interesting story. You all know near-death experiences: going down a tunnel, meeting a being of light, going into this pastoral realm, a life review, and then being sent back. And we were interested in this. We were particularly interested in those which occurred during cardiac arrest. So we put a grant into Welcome. Now, 30% of people with cardiac arrests, let's start further up, 10% of people with cardiac arrests will have near-death experiences. Of that 10%, 30% will in fact have an out-of-body experience, watch the resuscitation process before they go down the tunnel. Now that's the group we wanted to target, because if we left something around that they could see when they were out of their bodies, then we would know that that was really when the experience occurred, because otherwise you can only infer it from the relationship between what went on in the experience and what they say happened. So what we did was, I didn't, but the person I was working with, Sam Harnier, put up in the hospitals cards, this was in Southampton, on the roof. Now, we had 69 cardiac arrests, and 11% had near-death experiences. 7 were prototypical near-death experiences. But as you can see, because you're going to have 30% of the 10%, the chances with a small sample like that of getting somebody wasn't any good. So we wanted to do a huge survey. So we put in a grant to the Wellcome, said we'd like to do it. Now, it's very difficult to get money out of the Wellcome, and they took a long time deciding, but finally they said, your science is very good, we approved the grant, but no cards on the ceiling. Why? Because it's very difficult for a charity like the Wellcome to do what is fringe science. And so they couldn't take it as being scientific. So they said, yeah, do the study, because that's straight science, but no cards. And so what did we say? I said, no, and take the money. Now that's left us in a position where we don't have any money, but we have got a little. We've got some from the Bial Foundation and some from the Resuscitation Trust, just enough to get a nurse. And so what we have done is we have in fact gone through this process of putting cards up. We had a very good idea, and that was that we would use resuscitation officers, because every hospital has a resuscitation officer. They have to go to every resuscitation if they can. At any rate, they carry out an audit on it to make sure it's been done properly. So we asked the resuscitation officers if they'd take part in the experiment, but they all said yeah. So we put the cards up, went through ethics, did everything properly. And then the resuscitation officers wouldn't do it. Not because they wouldn't do it, but because they have other things to do and they weren't getting paid, and so it had low priority. Now, if you leave cards on the ceiling in hospitals for long enough, the areas get redecorated and the cards get taken down. So at one time we had 22 hospitals in this country, which has now come down to 10. But we've now got a nurse, and so she goes around to all the hospitals, finds out who's had a cardiac arrest, and we're beginning to collect data from them. And we'll be able to see in those 10 hospitals if people have seen the cards. So I don't know the answer yet. But I had a PhD student, a lass from Swansea called Penny Sartori, and she's a very live wire, and she carried out a PhD study in a coronary care unit and an intensive care unit. And she only got 2 people who left their bodies definitely. But she had a number of people who said they did, but with no real proof that they had. So she took a group of people who said they'd left their bodies and asked them what happened during the resuscitation. The group of people who said they were unconscious throughout the resuscitation and asked them what happened during the resuscitation. The group that left their bodies were much more accurate in describing the resuscitation process, showing it wasn't guesswork. So it's a straw in the wind. That's all. We haven't got definite proof yet. So it's on its way.
Have you personally had any stories of experiencing death in these experiences?
Sorry, any study of?
Do you personally have any experiences of it, of being in a room with somebody and talking with people that have, or seeing?
Come on, can you repeat it?
do you personally have any experiences of being in a room with someone who's dying and talking to relatives?
Me, myself, no. Because that's why I did the carer study, because I'd never worked with the dying, and I felt, first of all, ethics probably wouldn't give me permission to talk to the dying, and secondly, I hadn't got enough experience when we started to be able to know the sorts of things that I was expected to see and so on. But we hope to start a study with a hospice in Inverness, where we spend our summer holidays. And the consultant palliative care physician says that it would be much better if we did it talking to the dying before they die, rather than just to the carers. And so we're setting that up, and then I'll be able to answer your question, but no at the moment. Yeah.
I've had such an experience. My cousin died in intensive care, and she told us on quite a few occasions that there was somebody in the room at the end of her bed, and her name was Jasmine, and she'd come to take her away. She would actually have conversations with her as well.
Yes. Did she know who Jackie was or not?
Jasmine, we couldn't recall who she was. My cousin, she wasn't sure, because she was in a very confused state, actually. As we asked her if she knew Jasmine.
Yes.
Like that.
That's really interesting. She was in intensive care, wasn't she?
Yes.
And so they obviously do visit in intensive care. But usually, because the intensive care people have a lot of unconscious patients when they die, they quite often don't get stories of these phenomena. Or if they do, they tend to think that they're due to drugs or whatever. Which they're not. It's a nice story, thank you.
Just like to say that I've enjoyed reading the book. Very enjoyable. It's not sad or morbid. And one of the things that's happened is that I'm less fearful of my death now.
Sorry, say that.
I'm less fearful of my own death now.
Oh, I'm so pleased, because that's really why it was written.
Yeah.
Because, as you can see from the stories, that if you're lucky enough to get an end-of-life experience, there's nothing to be frightened of. And particularly if you're able to move to this other reality, it's very loving, and it's full of compassion and light. It's okay.
But I do get worried when the cat comes in the room and jumps
So you should. But if you believe the Dalai Lama, you're going to know 1 to 2 years before anyway. You have to listen very carefully. Yeah.
I've had several experiences of being aware of somebody at the time of their death, where they sort of made a connection for some reason or
Philip.
So,
Philip, repeat.
Hakim's had several experiences where he's been aware of someone, friends of his who have died, who have made a connection with him at the time of death.
You've had that. Fantastic. Can you tell us what it was like? Were you awake or asleep?
the first one was somebody who I knew as a kind of spiritual teacher, and
Yeah.
I was actually meditating on sending healing to somebody else who I knew who was dying of cancer, but not at the very point of death. And I suddenly became aware of this teacher, and what I saw was like a bunch of flowers in a vase, and there were curls of light, just sort of a swirl, each of them like a red one and a green one. There were a whole bunch of them that were like a bunch of roses in a vase, and I just knew it was connected with this person. And when I asked about her, I was told that that was when she died. So that was the first time I experienced it.
Really fascinating.
There was another one who he was a friend who was dying of cancer, very slowly, and it was actually during the time of the announcement of the Good Friday Peace Agreement in Northern Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
And I just kept on thinking, well, what about Marcus? I wasn't at the hospital at the time, and it turned out that 5:45 on that Good Friday was when he died. And I was just, my attention was totally on him. And there was another one,
And you knew of his death, did you?
Well, I found out a few hours later that he had died at that time.
Okay.
And there's another one, who was my father, that I wasn't actually aware that I was doing something directly connected with him. And that I sat down with some books thinking about him. There was information about him that I thought was directly connected with him. It turned out that I sat down with his books at exactly the time he died.
That's fascinating. There's no doubt in your mind that there's a very strong coupling between the person who's dying and you.
Yes. Actually, the things that I had done, I've become aware that my father was autistic, and I had got some books on the subject of autism.
Oh, really?
I'm very clear that it was my understanding that he was autistic, and that explained his behaviour. It was what released him to die.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. And I think they are there. There are a lot of them there. And the stories, of course, we get are the ones which are most dramatic and most persuasive to the people. And that's why they tell them to us. But we've got loads of stories about people at cocktail parties who suddenly became aware that they had this terrible feeling and they had to go home, and then there were all the messages on the answer phone saying the person who's died. Or we got one or two stories of people who had to go and visit their parents and they didn't know why, and their parents said, "Hey, nice to see you," and then he has a stroke either that day or the next day. So there are all these things linking the death process to the close emotional relationship with people. Fascinating. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, if any of you would like some of these brochures, do take them, particularly if any of you have a local hospice, which you can take and give them to. They're free. If you want a book, you have to pay for it. My wife will tell you how much. How much are they, Elsa?
I don't know, I think it's still at the Amazon price, which is much cheaper. I think they are really good.
8, did you say? With £8 if you want a book. They are very cheap. Okay, so let me thank you all for coming. Say how nice it's been to talking to you all. And please, remember the Deathbed Visitors. Remember to send up a special request. Mine's going to be for angels. I'm on angels. And so you can guess who you like. And remember to negotiate too. So thanks very much. Thank you all. Thanks so much for your computer. It was really good.
How much that cost?
Free. That's for carers who are dying. That's for relatives who are dying. That's the more comprehensive one.
That's, I ought to get a couple of copies of this at least.
Take that one because it's different from the other.
Oh, okay.
I've got
Thank
an
you.
uncle who is what I call a coffin dodger.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
been on the point of dying for a very long time and he just can't quite do it.
Yes.
And so I think that my aunt, given a coffin,
Yes.
should be given something to help her.
Oh, yes. That's a very good one.
All right.
Simply because it was written. That one, which one have you got? That one is very simple.
Right. Well, I've been intending to go and pay a visit because my uncle's inability to die is killing my aunt.
Yes.
It's wearing her out.
Of course.
He's 94 and she's 84.
Oh gosh, you should let go and go, really, shouldn't you?
Yes, it's been...
See Freud?
Oh, extremely. You see, a death camp survivor.
Oh yes. Oh, is he?
Yes, he was he's Polish and he was sent to the Soviet Gulag. He has not processed that at all.
Yeah.
I know from my own experience with him.
Yeah.
He's an extremely difficult person. Oh no, he can't. I'm actually wondering about particular esoteric things to do with him. But one of the things that I've been doing for a while is when somebody I know has died, I meditate with them. And my father was a horrendously terrible person to me when he was alive. But I've had several experiences with him since he died. He actually came to me and said thank you for all the things that he did for me. And a friend of mine committed suicide in December, and he's completely unresponsive to attempts to help him to progress and move on. But I left my father with him. He appeared and said, can I help? And so I said, well, he's not responding to me. After several meditations, he hasn't responded at all. And so I left my father with him to say, do what you can to help.
That's really nice. And do you know if it had any effect?
I don't know yet, because for some reason I haven't been back to check with him.
Yes.
It's just something that came to me to do.
Yes.
That I can do to help people who are dying.
Yes. Yes.
So,
that's really nice.
Can you write your name and sign it for me,
Yeah, sure.
please?